Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 32nd week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Zook. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, occasionally even innocently, and then having our colleagues comment on them. Previous programs are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, not all unadulterated praise, and some answers from us. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Today is August 8th. On this day in 1945, with a prostrate Japan under its feet, or rather under its bombs, the U.S. prepared for what Noam Chomsky has called the most grotesque scientific experiment in history. Chomsky has written that when you think about Hiroshima, maybe you can give an argument, maybe you can't, I don't really think you can, but at least it's not an outer space. I can't conceive of any argument for Nagasaki. And then it doesn't stop there, of course. There was that event which I wrote about 30 years ago, which I never see mentioned, although it's in the official Air Force history. It's what the official Air Force history calls the finale. General Hap Arnold, who was the Air Force commander, decided that to end the war, it would be nice to do it with a bang, with a grand finale. What he wanted to do was to see if he could organize a 1,000-plane raid on Japan. Getting 1,000 planes together was a big managerial achievement in those days. But he managed to get his 1,000 planes, and they bombed cities, civilian targets, on August 14th, described in a very upbeat fashion in the Air Force history. It was after the surrender had been announced, but before it had been officially received. That one didn't kill as many people as the atom bombs, but in a way it was more depraved. The Air Force, the American Air Force, dropped leaflets with the bombs over Tokyo, saying, the war is over, your country has surrendered. They came down with the bombs that destroyed Tokyo and killed more people than were killed at Nagasaki. Chomsky has written recently, the paroxysm of slaughter and annihilation did not end with the use of weapons that may well bring the species to a bitter end. We should also not forget that these species-terminating weapons were created by the most brilliant, humane, and highly educated figures of modern civilization, working in isolation, and so entranced by the beauty of the work in which they were engaged that they apparently paid very little attention to the consequences. Significant scientific protest against nuclear weapons began in the labs in Chicago after the termination of their role in the creation of the bomb, not in Los Alamos, where the work went on until the grim end, or not quite the end. The last bomb, the one after the experiment on Nagasaki, was to be dropped on Tokyo, but they considered Tokyo a poor target because it was destroyed. It had been incinerated by an attack in March, and therefore it was included in the grand finale, but it was spared an atom bomb, although the bombing of Tokyo, as I say, was in fact more lethal than the experimental bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. So you're watching News from Neptune, a Nagasaki edition, remembering the most grotesque scientific experiment in history. And we will begin tonight with the birthday boy, Ron Zook. Belated congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think birthday recognitions and celebrations are actually for children, and the less I hear about them, the better. But anyway, everyone should lose interest in birthday parties after about the age of 12 or 13, I think. But I'm
not inviting you to my next birthday party.
You get no cake at mine.
Yeah, right. There are several things we could talk about today. The hot topics apparently being the state of academic freedom at the great university down the street,
Right.
Inequality, and a lot is being said about that, or about Gaza. And I'd rather reserve the foreign policy and military stuff to another show that will be recording separately. But what is your choice? You want to talk about inequality or
Why don't you talk about inequality, then I'll talk about the foreign policy stuff.
Okay.
Oh, don't leave me academic freedom, for God's sake.
Yeah, right.
I'll just start crying.
Headline: the typical household now worth a third less. Economic inequality in the United States has been receiving a lot of attention, but it's not really an issue of the rich getting richer. The typical American household has been getting poorer, too.
Mm-hmm.
The inflation-adjusted net worth of the typical household was $87,992 in 2003. 10 years later, it was only $56,335, or a 36% decline, according to a study financed by the Russell Sage Foundation. Those are figures for a household at the median point of wealth distribution, the level at which there are an equal number of households whose worth is higher and lower. But during the same period, the net worth of wealthy households increased substantially. So it goes on in this vein about the accumulation of wealth and income in the highest ranking layer of the population. So another headline from the Wall Street Journal, no less. Breaking news: the rich are rich and the poor are poor.
From the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah. New study shows that the top 1% are richer than we thought. As reported by Bloomberg and others. Well, there was there's a breathless headline in the Huffington Post which reads, "The world's 1% are richer than you could possibly imagine." My response, this writer, is that HuffPost must have had a very low opinion of how fertile my imagination could be. The economic researchers, have found that previous estimates of the wealth held by the richest sliver of the world's people were too low. Instead of holding about 34% of the total wealth, the super wealthy 1% actually owned closer to 37%, and the top 1/10 of 1%, the fortunate one in 1,000, owned about 23.5%, up from 21.5% previously estimated. It turns out that it's very hard to measure how much the rich own, in part because the rich are very secretive. One thing money can buy is privacy. The rich hide a lot of assets in tax havens to escape the prying eyes of the tax collector, and many of the ultra-rich don't want journalists, academic researchers, or potential kidnappers to know just how much they've amassed. Why, they don't even fill out survey forms asking about their net worth. So I've noticed this before. People who are doing social research, as sociologists, are always looking at poor people, researching them, telling them what's wrong with them, and how they should change their attitudes and their beliefs and practices, and so on.
Character, David Brooks says.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But you try to start researching rich people, the power structure research that we heard so much about in the 1960s, and strange things start to happen. You'll find yourself in trouble, generally, and with the law, faster than you can imagine and account for. So why is that? Well, rich people don't like to have people poking around, finding out what they're doing and how much they own, and they're able to enforce that on people, nosy researchers coming around trying to find out what they're up to. Meanwhile, at the other end of the scale, over 35% of the U.S. are facing debt collectors. More than 35% of Americans have debts and unpaid bills that have been reported to collection agencies, according to a study released Tuesday by the Urban Institute. These consumers fall behind on credit cards or hospital bills. Their mortgages, auto loans, or student debt pile up unpaid. Even past due gym membership fees or cell phone contracts can end up with a collection agency, potentially hurting the credit scores and job prospects of those people. Roughly every third person you pass on the street is going to have debt in collection. Radcliffe said, this researcher, it can tip employers' hiring decisions or whether or not you get that apartment. The study found that 35.1% of the people with credit records had been reported to collections for debt that averaged $5,178 based upon September 2013 records. The study points to a disturbing trend. The share of Americans in collection agencies has remained relatively constant, even as the country as a whole has whittled down the size of its credit card debt since the official end of the Great Recession in the middle of 2009. So there it is. A few people are doing fabulously well at an ever-increasing rate, and a whole lot of other people are facing bigger and bigger problems. It's a functional necessity of the system, apparently, for people to be in debt and keep owing money. And whether it's student debt or credit card or medical debt or whatever, there's a whole lot of it, and I think many people don't realize how widespread it is. Meanwhile, this inequality has come in for some notice, even by Standard & Poor's, who published a research paper apparently in the last week or so, attributing slow economic growth to the degree of inequality that we have in this country. Paul Krugman, the New York Times columnist, has remarked on this. For more than 3 decades, almost everyone who matters in American politics has agreed that higher taxes on the rich and increased aid to the poor have hurt economic growth. Liberals have generally viewed this as a trade-off worth making, arguing it's worth accepting some price in the form of lower GDP to help fellow citizens in need. Conservatives, on the other hand, have advocated trickle-down economics, insisting that the best policy is to cut taxes on the rich, slash aid to the poor, and count on a rising tide to raise all boats. But there's now growing evidence for a new view, mainly that the whole premise of this debate is wrong. So again and again, as conservatives get into office, they will say what's needed to deal with the national debt is to lower the taxes on the rich and turn to a policy of austerity to deal with the poor. And this is just wrong. It sends the debt, as the state of Kansas has discovered in their recent tax-cutting binge, and causing more severe problems than people ever knew that they had. So the Governor Brownback of Kansas has turned up in the last day or two, blaming Barack Obama for the economic problems of Kansas after his practice of cutting the taxes of the rich and trying to impose more austerity on the poor. So
it's amazing they can get something right, huh?
So interesting piece here about the medical debt and the situation of medical insurance and so on. Opinions of that have been mostly negative, but are trending now toward people's general attitude toward government. And the cliche, of course, is that we need smaller government, and it's big government that's the problem, and we're going to do anything that we have to do in order to slash the size of the government. So we can generate more taxes by tax revenue by cutting the taxes on the rich and practicing austerity on the poor. But when you ask people's opinion about this, strange things start to happen. It's been noticed before. You ask people's opinion about the schools, for example, education is a total disaster, according to these people. That's completely wrong, and everything about it is wrong. And yet you ask them about their school in their neighborhood, the one that their children go to. Well, it's pretty good. They like it. Ask them about Congress, and you'll get a line about how horrible and terrible and evil and rotten it is, but their congressman is pretty good. This keeps happening again and again. So this has led some political scientists, quote unquote, to characterize the American public as symbolic conservatives but operational liberals. When you ask them abstract questions about whether they prefer small government to big government, whether they favor less regulation over more regulation, a majority give the conservative answer. But when you ask them about the specific things that government does, a majority will say that government should do and spend more on almost everything: education, medical research, social security, environmental protection, and on and on. The two exceptions tend to be foreign aid and welfare. This is why Republicans tend to talk in broad terms about government, while Democrats tend to talk more in more specific terms about programs. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, I'd like to comment actually on that last point, Ron, because it seems to me that it points up not the fecklessness of the American populace so much as the effectiveness of what Noam Chomsky has called the manufacture of consent, the way in which an account of what is going on in society is imposed by essentially methods of advertising, public relations, and so forth, on the majority of Americans, and it produces the schizophrenia that you just you sketched. Symbolic conservatives, i.e. they repeat the sorts of things they've been told by CNN and the mainstream media about what's going on in the country, but operational liberals, they certainly do want supports for health care, for education, for housing, the sorts of things that people naturally want, and the effort of the media dominated by the 1% is to give them reasons why they can't have them. And the result is that split you just described. The question is not what the American public wants. The polls are clear on this. The problem is this vast fog of misinformation within which Americans live, and it has a peculiar characteristic. In countries with a controlled press, the population knows the press is controlled and what they're being told isn't true. In a country that has a mythology of a free press, people don't know that what they're being told is controlled, and therefore they assume it's probably the case.
Yeah, well, this is part of a larger story that I'll be returning to from time to time. What I call verbal fetishes. You'll read another attack on socialism in the newspaper. It's long been known, for example, that people want what socialism stands for in large part.
Exactly.
But the term itself drives them crazy. They love to denounce it and accuse other people of being socialist. So,
and that's not an accident. Yeah. That's a result of one of the greatest advertising campaigns in history.
Yeah. So there's this whole area of slogans, buzzwords, catchphrases, cliches, and formulas that people try to use to do their political thinking for them. And I'm trying to resist that, but I'm not making much headway, I guess. That's all.
Thank you. Comments, David?
Just that the idea that our choices are between something called big government and small government is a rather meaningless one.
Yes.
It's one that keeps getting rammed down our throats.
Yep.
But that isn't how to begin to think about government. It's not how to begin to even think about the first word of a decent question about what kind of government we ought to have and what the function of government in a democratic society should be. So once we start talking about big government and small government, which is what the dominant class wants us to talk about, then there's no point in even going on from there.
Well, let me defend that in a way, David. Speak of the business of big government and small government. I'll stick up for those who say the problem is big government. If you let me suggest that the way to get at it is to pick that item, whatever it happens to be, that the government spends most on and eliminate it. I'm happy with that. Let's make government smaller by cutting out the business biggest expense. Well, the biggest expense is clearly the military, and if the Pentagon budget were to disappear, or do we return to useful work, the small government people, I suppose, would be theoretically pleased. We've removed the biggest part of big government, but the situation, I think, would be good.
But just to go back to Ron's original point about household wealth, why is it important how wealthy households are? I mean, you could show that, generally speaking, younger households are just getting started and they don't have much money, and middle-aged people maybe have a little more, and by the time people retire, maybe they have a little more. But the point is, why do households need to have wealth? Well, because we're playing the game of neoliberalism and what's come to be commonly called financial capitalism, or the financialization of our economic system, and what that means is that your household wealth indicates your opportunities in life, and your debt is the converse of that. So if we had a government system, if we had a non-financialized government system which provided daycare, provided education through college, provided medical care, and provided a decent pension, along with perhaps some affordable public housing according to income, then it wouldn't really matter quite as much, A, whether people had saved up a lot of money during their working lives, and B, whether they could pass a lot of money on to their children, because people would know as they move through life that their basic needs would be taken care of. They could choose to supplement those needs with working the kind of job that they want, however little or much it might pay. But because we have a financialized economy in which wealth, in which one's opportunities are measured in terms of one's personal accumulated household wealth, that inequality means something. It means something. You wouldn't have that kind of inequality in a less financialized, society, but we do. And I think that it's important that the people who are talking about what the financialization of our economy means are saying some really important things. Sometimes it's in a Marxist framework, sometimes it's in a Keynesian framework, but it's important to understand how this has happened at the household level, at the corporate level, at the banking level, and how Wall Street has got its dirty little hands into every aspect of our lives, and how there are other ways of running an economy.
Well, sometimes also in a religious framework, but we don't hear a lot about that.
Religious?
Yes.
How so?
What do you mean?
The financialization of the economy you're talking about,
Yeah.
and the pursuit of mammon and all of that. And there are a number of religious figures who have said that this really blights our entire life, that kind of concern.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
yeah. I
yes,
see. Yeah. No,
greed for money,
absolutely.
etc.
Yeah.
The counterexample, of course, which most Americans are shockingly not aware of are the other developed countries which had to rebuild after the Second World War.
Yeah.
Remember, the U.S. was essentially the only undamaged major country that emerged from the Second World War, either amongst the winners or the losers, so to speak. And major rebuilding was necessary from across the world. The result was a system far closer to the one that you just described, David, in countries from Scandinavia to Japan, where education is largely free, pensions are available, medical services are largely free, so forth and so on. And when you describe these situations and these societies and the social supports to most Americans, the only real comeback is, yes, but they have to pay a lot of taxes. Well, maybe there's at least a germ of truth in that, but the fact of the matter is that what is being sold to Americans on the open market, so to speak, is a societal responsibility in these other societies, and the results are far closer to what you describe, and according to most of the people who know both societies well, the results are far better. For example, Canadians, most of whom live actually along the U.S. border and know American society much better than most Americans know Canadian society, when asked to compare and contrast the medical services in Canada with the medical services in the United States, overwhelmingly opt for the Canadian form. It works better. Well, Americans don't know that, in part because they're told, oh, those Canadians have to pay high taxes for their medical services.
And how does the media deal with that? The media deals with that by creating the myth that Canadians don't like their healthcare
Yes,
system.
exactly.
Otherwise, why do they come to this country for their health care? Well, it's complete nonsense.
It is.
There's no evidence to really prove that in any major way that happens. But you've got to say something, so you've got to make up something. So that's what you make up. And I know that because I was asked that in both interviews I did during my campaign with right-wing talk show hosts. I was asked why Canadians are coming to this country for their health care.
Only a few of the wealthiest do. And they can get faster service and more technologically advanced service here.
Well, even that's not always the case.
Yes,
I remember the Senator, what was his name? Tsongas of Massachusetts, who finally left Massachusetts and went to Canada to be treated for his long-standing cancer that eventually killed him. But the treatment in Canada was both more available, more technically advanced, and all around better than what he could get in his own home state of Massachusetts, which he represented in the Senate.
Yeah. I'm going to just add a couple of footnotes to this conversation and these references I've been making to the financialization of the economy. It's a difficult concept. I often refer to interviews that are done on the Real News Network, TRNN.com. There's been some done recently with an economist who works in Britain who is of Greek background. His name is Kostas Lapavitsas, and he's written a book called Profiting Without Producing, which is a critique of the financialization of the economy from a Marxist perspective. And I admit that it's pretty tough going, and I'll even admit that it was so tough going that I didn't quite have the time to really read it as thoroughly as I would like to. But I think what he's saying is important. But also there's very important things being said about at a much more basic and accessible level by economists like Dean Baker and by people who are generally define themselves as Keynesian economists. And I think what they're getting at is a very fundamental misunderstanding of how the economy works. And it's something that, again, I found myself up against in terms of when I was talking to people during my campaign and being interviewed during my campaign. And the question is, how do we pay for that? How do we pay for that? And the thing that I started saying during my campaign was, if you think of the wealth of the economy in terms of that is what is produced by the labor of the people, then the question, how do we pay for that, becomes nonsensical. Yep. It becomes, the question is, how do we use money? How do we use the money that's issued by the government to employ people to produce the goods and services that people want, given the limits of labor, given the limits of resources, given the limits of productivity. How do we employ everyone? And I think in relationship, there's another kind of Keynesian or post-Keynesian school of economic thinking called modern monetary theory, which has been getting a little more press lately. It comes out of the University of Missouri at Kansas City, which is probably most well known for an economist named Michael Hudson, but there's many other, and Bill Black as well, who you often see on the Real News. And what they're arguing about is that we have to begin to think about the relationship between money and wealth in a very different way. And the fact that what these people are saying makes perfect common sense, and therefore you know why you don't hear about it in the mainstream media. You know, they're talking about how the government can use money to put people to work.
Yeah, there was some talk about that in the 30s during the economic social unrest. Then the difference between production for use and production for profit.
Yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense in a kind of Marxist context, but in the Keynesian context, it also makes sense in terms of the kind of fiscal programs. You know, the idea that the government can, in a sense, create money to bring labor together with productive resources.
Exactly.
And that I'm not saying you shouldn't be a Marxist. I'm just saying, and I think that Marxists who analyze these sorts of issues go more deeply into understanding of why it is we don't hear about these things, what it is about class struggle that makes it in the interest of the ownership class for us to talk about money in this way. So even Paul Krugman can talk about money in this way without necessarily making, you know, Paul Krugman keeps saying, why don't people understand this? This is obvious to economists understand that, no, we don't need austerity, we need spending.
Right.
But it's in the interest, it's in class interests for us not to understand that. Or to get back to that basic quote from Upton Sinclair, being that when your salary depends on not understanding something, then you don't understand it, and that defines the ruling class in this country.
And these questions, I think, can be fruitfully reflected upon outside of technical discussions of Keynesianism or even Marxism. Very worthwhile to reflect on what the old man in the British Museum, he wasn't that old at the time, was writing about, and Lord Keynes, what Lord Keynes had to say about the economy and the peace of the world in the early 20th century is also immensely valuable. But the questions are, in some sense, more basic. We look around in society and see an immense amount of work that needs to be done. Repair of the infrastructure, teaching children, building food, making available food, clothing, and shelter for all the people in the society. There's all sorts of work that needs to be done. We look around and we see overwhelming unemployment. Not just in this country, but even more elsewhere. Overwhelming unemployment. In other words, people available to do the work. Now, what do you say about a society, or if you want to call it an economic system, that is unable to put together people who want to work and work that needs to be done? You know, it should be a fairly straightforward arrangement, huh? And it turns up in a lot of ways. People point out that there are enough vacant houses in America to give every homeless person in America 6 of them. Now, 6 times as many vacant houses as there are homeless people in America says that there's something gone wrong with the system that provides shelter for our fellow citizens. Now, maybe it's time to start thinking about more basic ways of doing that. And I'd like to come back around to a fascinating study I read years ago that picks up the point that Ron started with tonight, the inequality business, under the rubric of the Nagasaki bombing, which we are celebrating in a way today. if you look at the societies, the damaged societies, the destroyed societies that emerged from the Second World War, notably Japan, but also Europe, and look at where they are now, we can learn something from how the reconstruction took place. A few years ago, a group of economists set out to figure out the causative factors for longevity in modern industrialized society. What makes it the case that some people live longer than others, or more importantly, what makes it the case that a population in general has greater longevity than another? What are the factors that make for it? Diet, smoking, genetic background, healthy climate, what are these things? And they threw all this stuff, this is an early big data project, they threw all this stuff into the mix and looked for correlations. What correlated with longevity, with long life? They found one overwhelming factor in correlation. It wasn't smoking, it wasn't diet, it wasn't even pollution in the atmosphere, it wasn't even genetic. The overwhelming correlation was with equality in the society. The more unequal the society was, the greater its Gini index was, the less or the lower the longevity in the society was, and conversely. And they looked around and found that the society, the industrialized society with the greatest longevity, was Japan. And the reason was that Japan, having been destroyed, having been reduced to rubble, physically and socially, we might say, in 1945, was rebuilt from the ground up on the basis of much more equality than obtained in the countries that were not so destroyed. And the studies said in a way, the hero of their investigation turned out to be, of all people, General Douglas MacArthur, the American fascist general who presided over the reconstruction of Japan after in the American occupation. Because the result of his policies was to produce a society which, by the end of the century, was much more egalitarian than the other industrialized societies, and as a result, provided greater longevity. Now, there are lessons here. The sociologists actually can tell us something sometimes, and there are certainly important lessons for what we should be doing with our economy that are basic, straightforward, not a matter of even sophisticated theoretical discussion. That, by the way, was the starting point of Thomas Piketty's book when he tried to look at inequality and its development in the last century in Europe and America. So these are not insoluble problems. These are political problems.
Gee, Carl, I thought the longevity of the Japanese was due to the fact that they're eating rice and fish.
That was precisely, that was one of, I think that's where that study started. They thought their answer would lie in diet. And then they kept coming up with embarrassing things like smoking was so much more prevalent in Japan than it was in Western Europe even, or in America. And other things, all these unhealthy habits were turning up. They didn't come to the conclusion that smoking was good for you, but they did come to the conclusion that the correlation with longevity lay elsewhere. You're watching News from Neptune. Carl Estabrook, Ron Zoke, and David Green talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media. David, did you want to shift gears to another topic?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was tempted to say that longevity isn't the be-all and the end-all, but that doesn't quite sound right. But
Especially
anyway,
if you have to eat rice and fish. Right?
Yeah,
And can't smoke.
right. But anyway, yeah, I'm going to shift gears and talk about the familiar topic of Israel and Gaza and what's been going on there. I guess I wanted to say something I've been wanting to mention on a few last issues of News from Neptune is to mention the now not so recent death of the historian Gabriel Kolko, which I think deserves mention in terms of his illustrious career as a historian, probably as productive and incisive as anyone since World War II, and really dealing with a lot of these issues that we're talking about on this show. So anybody not who isn't familiar with his basic work about the Vietnam War and about the long arc of the economic history of this country can really learn a lot from that, as I have. But in any event, we have a chancellor at the U of I who's giving hypocrisy a bad name. I just finished reading a book called The Political Economy of Human Rights by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. There are actually 2 volumes of this. The second one was about Southeast Asia in the late 1970s and media coverage of that. And the thesis of this book is that what you can expect the coverage to be is what the elite privileged classes need for it to be in order to pursue their classist agenda. And of course, they proved that in the coverage of Cambodia in the late 1970s, in contrast to East Timor, and so forth. And so I've been thinking about the political economy of for one thing, academic freedom in this community and in this country. It seems like academic freedom becomes real important when it's to the interests of some people that this university have relationships, whatever those relationships might be, with institutions in Israel that may participate in the occupation of Palestine in some pretty blatant ways. But it doesn't seem like academic freedom becomes so important when the university Native American Studies program hires a man who is set to come here and teach some courses, who has a reputation for being critical of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and of the U.S. government's support for that treatment. So under the radar, without a whole lot of, again, with the usual kind of shady operating procedures in which the chancellor won't actually appear in public and make a statement and answer questions about what is going on here. This sort of thing just goes down, and in the meantime, another local professor who I think also has been on both sides of this issue in relationship to the BDS movement as well as the hiring of this man, the professor in question, who was perhaps no longer coming here. His name is Stephen Saleta, and the professor who seems to be on both sides of the issue of academic freedom is, of course, Carrie Nelson. And so what we have going down in recent days, besides the perfect sort of genocidal, and I use the word advisedly in relation to Gaza, we have this academic squabble here, which is kind of reverberates from that conflict. I shouldn't encourage us to take our eye on that conflict and talking about it very much in terms of the political economy of what Chomsky and Herman called the political economy of human rights, or the political economy of genocide, or the political economy of so-called worthy victims. But I think as we see the word Hamas become demonized,
yes,
the word Hamas sort of, as much as it's repeated by Benjamin Netanyahu and everyone else on the pro-Israeli side of this conflict, we see that word sort of morphing into a meaning, becoming sort of almost like saying Hamas is like saying Hitler. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to really attend to language. We really need to attend to truth, the relationship between language and truth, this rather loose relationship that we have in our political culture and in every political culture between language and truth. As George Orwell, his essay gets referred to on a regular basis. The Politics of the English Language should be read by anybody who hasn't read it. And we have to move forward from there into working at continuing to clarify what reality might mean in some rough but accurate, in good faith way, and how language can be used to talk about what's actually going on, and how easy it is for people who think that they're on the right side of history, of genocide, of human rights, to be on the wrong side when it's their own government that's involved, how difficult that is to see for many people. I have to say that coming from the generation of the 1960s, it occurs to me that it was an unusual time. I don't know when the people of a country have ever opposed the war-making policies of the government of that country in quite such a almost general way as what happened in the 1960s. And now things are back to normal, and that's the problem.
I might want to take issue with that, David. I mean,
Well, we don't argue enough. Well, according to some of our fans,
That's true.
We don't
That's
argue
right.
enough about that. So let's go for it.
well, let me just say that it seems to me that those of us who were there, I mean, I am, after all, a time traveler from the 1960s, here to warn you about what happened then, which you have forgotten. Not you, David, but
Yeah.
you, I'm afraid. The popularity of John Kennedy's war was very great when it began.
Yeah.
Chomsky talks about being unable to give speeches against the war in the Boston Common for fear of being attacked by thugs. I mean, a very real fear. The police have basically to stop these rallies, and this was true in the early 60s. By the late 60s, 80% of Americans disapproved of the war and wanted it to end. We forget sometimes that Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968 because he opposed the war. The Democrats, in the case of the sad sack Hubert Humphrey, were saddled with the war that had driven Lyndon Johnson out of office, and the Republicans ran against the war in that election. Nixon had a secret plan to end the war, and that, according to the polls at the time, put him over the top, even though his winning personality was not always in evidence to American voters. So there was a sea change in American politics, American popular politics, from the early 60s to the late 60s, in the course of about 5 years. And we have to remember that the early 60s was in some sense living on the inheritance of the Second World War. I mean, of course the war was right, just as the war against Japan had been right, the war against Korea had been right, so forth. The war, obviously, we were actually fighting the same sort of people, weren't we, in Southeast Asia, and this was a foregone conclusion for most Americans up until about 1965. The fact that it changed, and changed so rapidly, and changed so completely, is an extremely important datum and an important part of recent American political history. In some sense, parallel with the rise of neoliberalism 40 years ago, there was also the rise of a vast industry sponsored by the 1% to reverse the popular understanding of America's wars. You remember after the first Gulf War, the crow of victory that we got from George Bush the first was, when now we have licked the Vietnam Syndrome. And once again, you had to be there to remember what that was. The Vietnam Syndrome was that conviction that 80% of Americans held by the end of the 60s that the U.S. was doing something quite wrong in Vietnam. The idea that American wars could be quite wrong was the Vietnam Syndrome that supposedly the adventures in Southwest Asia had brought to an end by 1991. Well, the last generation of America's wars has to be talked about, it seems to me, in that context. That's what we have to, that's what we have to deal with, because in fact we're back in a situation today in which 3/4 of Americans think there's something wrong with the U.S. Sending troops to Southwest Asia. To the Middle East, as we say. That's the biggest problem that the Obama administration has. Obama's remit, Obama's job, is to convince the American people that their worries about war are unfounded. That's made for some interesting tergiversations on the part of Mr. Obama. He's turned his back on a lot of the things that he said, including the fact that most Americans understood him to be saying that he was running against George Bush's war in 2008. Okay. To cover war with smooth names is what the Obama administration is meant to do, and it continues as we speak.
Isn't there a general pattern there of enthusiasm for these wars at first, and then within 3 or 4 years at most, when the consequences of it become more apparent, becoming disillusioned?
I'm not sure we can say that in a blanket fashion. Look, for example, at the invasion of Iraq. The largest anti-war demonstrations in history in the United States occurred not in the 1960s, but in the first years of this century. There were demonstrations against George Bush's the second attack on Iraq. They were huge demonstrations. Now, a lot of people wanted to say, where are the snows of yesteryear? Why do those demonstrations not result in a more serious opposition to the war that the U.S. carried on? And that's a worthwhile study. But notice what it did do was produce Barack Obama. Obama rose precisely as someone to follow the same policies as George Bush, but pretend he wasn't, and to convince the American people that the withdrawal was around the corner, the war was winding down, everything was in good hands. We weren't going to risk American troops because we were going to use drones, and drones didn't kill Americans; it just killed those nasty terrorists. And some children and so forth at the same time. The actual history of the anti-war movement from Vietnam to Afghanistan is yet to be written. And now one of the reasons it's yet to be written is there's been a substantial industry devoted to obfuscating the facts of that war. Nick Turse's recent book, Kill Anything That Moves, is only now, the book was published about 2-3 years ago, is only now a detailed account of the vicious way in which the war was fought in Vietnam by the United States. We swept that under the rug, or no, that's the wrong image. The rug had been pulled over that actively and aggressively by American intellectuals working for the 1% throughout my academic career. I watched it happening.
Yeah, I mean, these are just good questions to look back as we look back at the nature of anti-war movements, of war resistance of the people of this country, going back to World War I, and even during the 1930s, the so-called isolationism of the 1930s, and the efforts, the constant efforts of the government and the propaganda system to overcome this sort of basic resistance that Americans have towards, I guess, what George Washington called foreign entanglements, or whoever it was who used that phrase. But it just seems that, I see what you're saying, and I certainly agree with you about the fact that there was very little opposition to the war in 1964. As we go back and we observe the 50th anniversary of the Gulf of Tonkin, we can see that there really wasn't. The Cold War had kind of beaten that out of everyone. And
that was his job.
Yeah, right. And so it took a while for that to get going, and it's still around. And there's been ways that the government has gotten around that by ending the military draft, by enormous amounts of propaganda, by alliances with foreign governments and the use of foreign troops, by the use of contractors, very important use of contractors that the journalist Pratap Chatterjee has talked about in some of his work and some of his talks. So this is a very complicated business, and I think, like in understanding how our country works at an economic and financial level, it's also very mystifying for many people to understand how this military industrial complex works not just at the level of fighting wars, but contractors and spies and the 17 federal agencies that work along with along with the Pentagon to conduct these wars and these spying and all these operations in Africa and so forth. So again, we just have a lot of work to do, and I'm afraid the citizens of this country have a lot of work to do in trying to understand what's going on, because I don't see any other way that except consciousness raising that people are going to be able to organize against something. It's hard to organize against something that you don't understand.
This manufacture of consent to the war is noticed and remarked on by acute observers in the strangest places. I have, for example, in mind the author of the 1920s of a book called My Struggle, in which a political figure in jail, actually, writing about his politics of the time, raised the question of why Germany had lost the First World War. And his answer was that Germany had failed to mobilize the opinions of Germans about the war, whereas the British had done so, and the Americans as well. He said the British and the Americans had done so to such an extent that they were able to prevail in that in that war, a triumph of the will, and that the propaganda system, he didn't call it that, but that's what he meant, the information system in Germany was not so sophisticated. We won't let that happen again, wrote Adolf Hitler, reflecting on the nature of the First World War. Now, it seems to me that the arc is clear. What has happened in the 20th and the last century in terms of war, and the overwhelming necessity of constructing a populace that understands what the ruling class wants them to understand in regard to the war. That's the job. That's the manufacture of consent. And in America, we're pretty good at it. Concluding comments, gentlemen?
Well, yeah, there are a number of things that could be said about financialization. This is what Piketty, or however he pronounces it now, emphasizes in the R greater than G formula. Return on investments is so much higher than natural growth that that's where you make big money. And so that's what appeals to a lot of people. And I have this other paper we didn't get to. Why can't the banking industry solve its ethics problems? Because in the short term, there's a lot more money to be made in financial manipulation than in actually producing things that are useful to people.
Conclusions, David?
Conclusion, my goodness.
It's all conclusion.
How to conclude. How to conclude.
Shall we perhaps begin?
Yes, right. No, I just think that I think I concluded by saying that we have a lot of work to do in trying to explain the world around us and to try to use words in careful and accurate ways. One would think that at a major public university, that would be our project. But unfortunately, our project is too often, especially in the liberal arts and social sciences, for people who work on the margins of what goes on campus, is to expose that much of what goes on campus serves to sort of mystify our understanding of the world around us. So I will leave it at that.
Yeah.
If you can get to asking the wrong questions, you don't have to worry about answers. Thomas
I want to exclude, in terms of you know who you are, I exclude you from that conclusion.
There we are.
Right.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 32nd week of 2014, a Nagasaki Memorial Edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and Ron Zook. Our thanks to you, PTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Dan. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.